Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. Just had a few technical issues here with the old camera and the lights. So the lighting is slightly different than normally would be because my white jumper was upsetting the settings. But anyway, here we are. Nice to see you. My live light is still flashing on and off, I'm sorry to say. Hang on a moment, let's give it one more go. If I can find the... Oh, no. The chair fell over then. The chair fell over, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, it is on now. Just looking at the feedback. Oh yeah, there my chair goes. Anyway, here we are. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for joining me. Sorry about the strange lighting in the studio here. I need to sort this out. Anyway, welcome along and hello to. Let's find out who we have here. Presumably you can still hear me. That's the main thing in this version of the show. Hello to the lovely Julia, to Billabong O'Neill, to Turbo Stream, to a lot of chat going on there. Edward Moulding, to Audrey Forbes Hamilton, to Zomcoco, Justine Jones, David Vad, Andrew Norris, Philip Hammond and Mary, to Jen Coley, to Sensible Paul, Lee Lawson and H. Dudley Sawyer. Lights, actions, go. What have we got here? That's just me. Right. So so we just have to put up with the lights the way they are at the moment because due to circumstances my white jumper is causing chaos, but we'll be all right. We will be fine and dandy. I shall have a fiddle with it after this show. Right, let me just move that out of the way. Good stuff. You can hear me, which is marvellous. We are on chapter 74, ladies and gentlemen, in our little foray into London Belongs to Me. And I thought I brought a glass of water in. And hello to Steve G, who seemed to think that my Bluebells that I went to see at Clapham Wood was Spanish Bluebells. I think Linda Kane might have something to say about that, but she's not here, so she can't defend it. After all, it is she who sent me over there, you see. Anyway, there we are. Right, chapter 74. The end of the episode. The deliberate and calculated surrendering of all Mrs. Boone's connections with Dulcimer Street left Mrs. Josser depressed and unsettled. Throughout the arrest, the trial, the appeal, she had remained self-possessed and purposeful, had managed to keep on top of things, but there was no doubt about it, the sale of the furniture had been the climax. Everything else was now anticlimax. She was living in the trough of things at the moment. And it was about her own feelings that she was worrying. Oh, Lee Lawson's come to my defence. They're not Spanish Bluebells. She will defend them. There we are. Thank God for that. There we go. That's marvellous. Steve G, I'm afraid you've been outvoted. And it wasn't about her own feelings that she was worrying. It was about Mr. Josser's. The events of the past 3 months hadn't done him any good either. He was ageing visibly and rapidly. Having looked the same for as long as she could remember, at times it almost seemed that it had been a small grey-haired man whom she'd married. He was suddenly changing before her eyes. His hair was wispier now and thinner, and he was growing absent-minded. Twice lately he had gone through to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and then come back without having done it. He seemed, too, to be missing Doris more than he missed Ted. He spoke about her longingly as though she were part of a remote, delightful past. He was content to sit for hours, whole evenings in fact, just smoking and remembering. It was a vague, shaky sort of existence, not like real life at all. And in Mrs. Josser's present state, it was getting on her nerves. It was lucky, in a way, that there was the matter of Uncle Henry's will to distract her, and it was lucky, too, that she had placed the whole matter into Mr. Barks's hands, because he seemed to be so very efficient about everything connected with the law. It was only a bit strange, and a bit ironic when you come to think of it, that it was Mrs. Boone herself who had recommended Mr. Barks. In her present reduced condition, even remembering Uncle Henry, however, upset Mrs. Josser. She still had occasional qualms of conscience that she hadn't loved him more and been nicer to him, but finally she had to admit to herself that really Uncle Henry was far easier to love in retrospect than he had been in reality. As a family figure, there had always been something uncompromisingly prickly about him. All the same, she had found tears coming to her eyes more than once as she sat in Mr. Barks' office going over the details. It was the side of life that Uncle Henry himself would have despised most. And at times she had an uneasy feeling that Uncle Henry, with his socialist views, must somewhere at this very moment be feeling that, will or no will, she hadn't got any real right to the flourishing business that he had left her. His greengrocery and fruit connection should have reverted to the state or something. It came therefore as a shock, a positively breathtaking shock, to learn what Uncle Henry had been worth. Somehow she had always thought of him as one of themselves, not exactly poor, but certainly not among the moneyed classes. And she'd been wrong. Astonishingly wrong. Uncle Henry, with the sports shirt and the cranky views and his green bicycle, had been fairly rolling in it. By the time the whole estate had been wound up, there would be something... By the time the whole estate had been wound up, there would be something, Mr. Barks said, between £1,100 and £1,200. The effect of the news, when he told her, was to leave her at first staggered, then excited, then sick, as if it had been a decent moderate... If it had been a decent moderate sum like £250 or even £300, she could have borne it. But the immensity of £1,100 alarmed her, and in a strange way she felt ashamed. Ashamed because Mr. Josser, having worked hard for nearly 40 years, had managed to scrape together only just enough to think of buying himself a cheap cottage, whereas just by sitting back and not doing anything, she had suddenly become a rich woman. It's interesting that he was a socialist and that was the way it works, because it does seem that when you look at it, these socialists who shout the loudest seem to be rolling in a lot of money these days, and yet that isn't really what the philosophy is it? Seems very weird. Anyway, a rich woman. She turned the words over in her mind all the way back from Mr. Barks. A rich woman. It put her at once into Mrs. Vizard's class. Instead of merely renting 3 rooms in number 10, the Jossers could buy the whole place outright, if they felt inclined. They could expand. It was only a passing thought, however, because Mrs. Josser knew perfectly well that they didn't want to expand, and the idea became modified to refurbishing the 3 rooms they already had. Then that too was seen to be foolish notion that it was, because the 3 rooms didn't need refurbishing, and the spectacle of Connie flittering away her little nest egg rose up before her eyes. At all costs she must avoid that. As she recognised that she was just as easy to squander 1,100 as she'd been to squander 65, it was only as she recognised that it was just as easy to squander 1,100 as it had been to squander 65. It was only that it took longer. And, with actually spending the money out of the question, Mrs. Josser, to her surprise, found herself wondering what she would do with it. It seemed that, after all, she didn't really need it. Then the solution. the perfect solution that she would have, the perfect solution that she should have thought of straight away come to her. She would keep it intact, not touching a penny of it until the war was over, and then give it to Ted to buy a business. And what was more, she would write and tell him so. She would give him something. It would give him something to look forward to all the time that he was away. Only one thing left her unhappy about that. Cynthia. It was monstrous, positively monstrous, that simply because Uncle Henry, despite his odd ideas, had been hard-working, a painstaking sort of chap, a silly, giggling little ex-usherette, should reap the reward of it. She was still thinking about Cynthia when she reached Dulcimer Street, and her thoughts were so unsatisfactory that she couldn't bring herself to talk about them. In consequence, when Mr. Josser got back that evening from his rent collecting, and he was looking whiter and wispier and more frayed than ever, she didn't tell him a thing about it. She merely got him his supper and sat watching him while he ate it, without so much as a hint. It was, if anything, rather quieter than usual, and Mr. Josser asked her if she was tired. She had no ready answer, and so she ignored the question. She merely told him to hurry up with his meal so that she could get to bed early. It was a funny business becoming an heiress at 64. Funny and unnerving. Curious, that's very curious observation of life there, isn't it? That at 64, that she, an heiress at 64 is sort of almost deemed to be old. And goodness knows how old Mr. Josser is. He may be a bit older than that, presumably, probably about 67, 68, maybe. And that's deemed to be old. Doesn't seem to be old. I mean, when you're 20, 60s does seem to be old. Retirement age. But now if the average is up to 80, doesn't seem to be old at all. Philip Hammond and Mary, native bluebells droop their heads where Spanish ones hold their heads upright. Yes. Mary, I really saw what you mean on Sunday. Just gone. The English bluebells are smaller and daintier. Talking about bluebells, I've set you all off now. Didn't mean to. Lee Lawson says also native bluebells have cream pollen and the Spanish variations have pale mauve pollen. I'm beginning to think that Steve G didn't wishes he hadn't mentioned it now. Anyway, there we go. Sorry about that. It looks very dark on my screen. I'm so sorry about it being dark. Can't do anything about that at the moment. Not until later. Anyway, it was back then, says Anne H. 60s, in the 60s, I guess, was old. Isn't there any news of Percy? He's faded right out of it, now that the prison doors have closed on him. Doesn't he exist any more? Oh, yes, Percy still exists. You can see him if you want to, only you wouldn't recognise him. Not at first glance, that is. He's the one standing at the end of the room. It's a long room with bars at the windows. He's standing to attention with his heels together, but the clothes that he's wearing are so shapeless that he might as well be standing easy. Only his shoulders, where the jacket is a bit on the tight side, shows that he has drawn himself up for the occasion. In front of him is a short grey-haired man, a kind of foreman. He is dressed in double-breasted blue uniform with black buttons, rather like a park keeper's. Percy is in grey with clumsy black arrowheads stamped to it. Come round to the other side, and you can see his face. It's Percy, all right, but you'd never guess from the rear view. That's because his yellow hair has been sheared off. The wavy, shining halo that used to go about has completely gone, and in consequence his head looks much smaller. In fact, it looks definitely a small head. Perhaps it is. And the moustache that he was just getting started has gone too. It is just a very ordinary, rather weak sort of face that's left. Ever made a pair of shoes before? The foreman park keeper suddenly asks. He has to shout because there's so much noise going on down the length of the bay that Percy shakes his head. No, he says, after a pause. Sir? Feel you could learn? Percy grins. It's the same old grin, or very nearly. Perhaps it's a bit feebler round the corners. I'm a trained mechanic, I am. The grey-haired man looks up sharply. Not here, you're not, he says. You're a beginner, same as all of them when they start. And if you're going to make the grade, you go back to manual work with the rest, see? The grin has vanished now. Percy is looking for an opportunity of saying sir again. He's becoming very respectful since he came here. It's the only thing they understand. You'll start on souls, you will, the grey-haired man goes on. You'll keep on that till you know it. And if you don't seem to be learning, you'll go back, like I said. I see, sir. And no talking. There's enough noise without talking, and if you want anything, step back from the machine one pace and I'll attend to you when I come round. Your number 9 is your machine. There's always someone on it. Oh, sorry, there's someone on it now. You can stand by and watch. Don't get in his way, and don't talk. No, sir. That's all. Get going. Percy stands, watching. It's easy. He can see at once. It's just like kids play, like fretwork. There's a revolving knife, a moving band of metal at one end of the bench, and when the leather goes up against it, the knife cuts through it like a bacon slicer. All that the man in charge has to do is to twist the leather round a bit so that the shape comes out. But that too is easy. It's all marked out in blue pencil. You couldn't go wrong. The only thing is the speed. The man at the machine works as though he's become part of it. The rough soles keep piling up in a wooden box at his side where he flips them with one hand while the other is getting the next piece of leather ready. He's a drawn, elderly man, a pretty ancient sort of workman, though in that awful uniform he could be any age. Silently, without even looking up to see who's watching him, he goes on turning the leather and flicking the finished soles to one side. Wonder he doesn't go balmy, Percy thinks. Doing all that all day? Wonder he doesn't go balmy. Then the foreman comes round. Seen enough? Think you could do it? He asks, speaking close up to Percy's ears because of all the din. Yes, sir, Percy says. I shall be watching, says the foreman. Don't you forget that. I've got eyes in the back of my head, I have, and on both sides as well. Stand back, number 4382. The elderly man steps back, still without looking up. Hold the leather in your right hand and steady it with your left, the foreman says. And mind your fingers. They're the only ones you've got. Don't hurry. Take your time and be careful. Remember, you're learning something. Yes, sir. The foreman and the elderly workman move off. Percy is left alone with the machine. The fact that it is a machine is something. It belongs to his order of things. Of course, it's primitive, crude and primitive. Percy can think about a couple of improvements straight away just by looking at it, but perhaps he'd better leave the improvements till later. He's got to get on with things as they are now. Very gingerly, he puts the piece of leather up against the spinning blade, and the blade cuts quickly deep into the blue pencil line. I said careful, a voice at his elbow reminds him. Percy looks round. One of them bearings is loose, sir, he says. I could fix it for you. But the foreman is not pleased by the suggestion. If I want anything fixed, I'll send for a real mechanic, he says. And if I want you to know what needs fixing, I'll ask. If I don't, it's all right, isn't it? You're learning, not teaching, see? Yes, sir, Percy answers, twisting round the leather piece so that the snick in it shan't show any more. I see, sir. It's a bit grim, isn't it? It's a bit grim. Poor old Percy. We're on chapter 75. Mr. Puddy had got a germ, or something. It couldn't this time have been anything that he'd eaten, because ever since the last bout he'd been very careful about his food. He'd been avoiding all the made-up dishes. But the result was just the same. Whatever he ate, Mr. Puddy suffered stabbing pains, fits of giddiness, and a sense of profound dejection. This had been going on for nearly a week now, and he was growing morbid. He even began to fear that he might be losing weight, always a dangerous thing in a man, and his mind recoiled. It was a horrible thought, dying of starvation amidst of a world of plenty. He got so worried at last that he spent a penny at a weighing machine. The long red handle of the dial finally came to a rest at 13 stone 5 pound. But, as he couldn't remember what it should have been, this didn't really console him. And still the pains, the giddiness, and the dejection continued. He had tried all the patent medicines, of course, but there weren't any use for him. By now he was taking 2 or 3 different types of tablets, and a spoonful of this and that, and 6 droplets in water of the other every 2 or 3 hours. And he might just as well have saved himself the trouble. It looked, indeed, as though after a lifetime of serious eating, he was simply going to waste away and lose himself. So in the end, he went along to see a doctor. It was a terrifying experience. Terrifying because his own father, a profound, hearty eater like himself, had been carried off at about the same age by apparently the same mysterious ailment. He had dwindled away to less than 10 stone before expiring. And as Mr. Puddy sat in the stuffy little waiting room, he heard in his ear ancestral voices prophesying what his father had died from. The doctor went over Mr. Puddy slowly and carefully. There were wide, pale expanses of abdomen to be thumped and prodded, and he prodded hardest where the pain hurt most. When he had finished, he stepped back, and Mr. Puddy gripped the hard sides of the surgical couch while he was waiting for the verdict. But all that the doctor said was that Mr. Puddy needed exercise, and he said it in such a callous, unfeeling kind of voice. Instead of feeling relieved, Mr. Puddy was offended. He got up with as much dignity as a man can muster when his braces are down below his knees, and addressed the doctor. "The need for exercise is one thing," he said coldly, "and these stibots are another. I shan't waste another time here. I shall go round to the General Free. Good evening." I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, but there we are. I think the General Free is a hospital. And with that, he went, his pouchy, heroic head carried high, and his body rumbling and protesting as he moved. It was indeed 5 o'clock surgery that he had attended, and even now it was not yet 5:30. From the moment he had stepped down to the moment that he had buttoned up again, it had not taken 10 minutes at all. And the fee, because Mr. Puddy wasn't on the panel, was 5 shillings. 6pence a minute, he told himself morosely. That's what the doctor's impertinence had cost him. After the gloom of the dingy little surgery, the brightness of the early May evening dazzled him. He stood on the pavement outside, blinking at the sky through half-closed eyes, like a large grounded bat. The real trouble was that he didn't know what to do with himself. There was no point arriving at the warehouse until 7, and there was no point in climbing up all the stairs at number 10, only to come down again. And he didn't feel strong enough to go along to the hospital to be thumped and prodded again this evening. After a bit, he began to move off, not to anywhere in particular, because he hadn't got anywhere in particular to move off to, but simply because he couldn't just stand there any longer. And as a doomed man, he walked slowly. He mooched. His own coroner, he passed along the street, his eyes fixed on the pavement ahead of him. The trouble was... Sorry, itchy eye. The trouble was... I've lost my space. Where am I? The real trouble was that something told him that his number was up, or if not actually up, at least due to go up shortly. The way things were, even if the doctor happened to be right about Mr. Puddy's stomach, it only meant that he was being preserved from one kind of dreadful death for another, which was just as dreadful. Indeed, what was the matter with Mr. Puddy was probably his haunting presentiment of disaster. Through brooding it over for so long, he knew just how it would happen. It was round 2 in the morning when it was going to occur. The Germans at last would have turned their furious eye on London, and the bombs would be fairly raining down by then. He would be at the warehouse at the time, of course, sitting in the middle of the tinder pile, so to speak. There would be explosions all round him, as though the earth was giving away, and fires, huge, unquenchable fires, and choking, asphyxiating smoke. And the lights would go out, and he would be left somewhere in the centre of the furnace, with the last precious drops of water dripping from the nozzle of his stirrup pump, and the bucket empty. Even though it had been a warm night, Mr. Puddy's teeth were chattering at the thought of it. He had to close his eyes, and he could see the actual bomb, a big fat one shaped like a porpoise, with his name written in it in white letters round the side. High explosive, it said. High explosive added cedries. And he shuddered. It was a fairly pearly evening, and the high upper stories of the buildings were glowing back at the retreating sun. Even the buses, as they darted out of the shadows of the buildings, shone with more than their own natural scarlet. A barrage balloon resting idly on its cable was pure gold. But Mr. Puddy was oblivious to it all. It might have well been foggy. With his hands clasped despondently behind his back, so that the attaché case containing his dinner bumped against his knees, with every step he took, he mooched on. He had come quite a long way now, and already the fresh air had done him good. He was breathing more deeply, and the spots before his eyes seemed fewer. His thoughts, too, took on a gayer tinge. After a while he began recalling better times, old meals that he had eaten, the kind of stuff that even now he still had got stowed away in readiness for his recovery. In the midst of dissolution, his spirits returned to him, and he remembered what a lot of firemen there were in London nowadays. Trained men, quite young men, some of them, whose whole job it was to mop up incendiaries as fast as the Germans care to send them down. There was even an emergency water tank, like an elevated duck pond, just on the main entrance to the warehouse. So long as I hear the telephone, I'll be all right, Mr. Puddy told himself. It's only if I get cut off. Then I'll be for it. He unclasped his hands by now and was walking upright. Really walking this time, not mooching. And suddenly an idiotic and astonishing thought came to him. He decided that he would walk all the way to the warehouse. His self-respect depended on it. It would prove that he wasn't the sort of man who needed any surgery doctor to tell him to take exercise. And as he stepped out, he seemed to be entering his prime again. The wraths and spectres had been left behind in Kennington. All the same, it was a long walk. A very long walk. 4 miles, in fact. And for the last half mile, Mr. Puddy proceeded more slowly, and more slowly. And finally, he stopped entirely. Stopped and raised first one foot off the ground to ease it, and then the other. Each time that he lifted his foot with the remaining one had to take all his weight, and he winced. The walk had been just that much too long. Mr. Puddy's arches had fallen. Ah, poor old Mr. Puddy. Poor old Mr. Puddy. back in Dulcimer Street, Mr. Squales was in a bad way too. The worst possible, in fact. And that was because he was cornered. Positively cornered. There he was, he realised, gloomily, no other word for it, no other word, no way out, and it was appalling. What was so awful was that it was Mrs. Vizard's doing, with that nagging and inhuman persistence which is one of the most irritating things about women, especially loving ones. She had been quietly and secretly plotting behind his back, apparently, for weeks. It was for his sake, his good, that she had done it. He knew all about that. And even if he hadn't known it, she would have told him so to his face. The fact remained, however, that he didn't thank her for it. Not deep in his heart he didn't. And at the time there had been nothing for it, of course, but to smile back and say thank you. He had even added that he was quite bowled over by the news, as indeed he was, and to prove his gratitude he had gone so far as to kiss her hand. But that had been a mistake, because after all the trouble that she had been on his account, she was holding up her face for a proper kiss. The cause of his depression was that she had found him a job, and the absurd part of it was the job suited him perfectly. If he had found it for himself, he would have given his heart away to Mrs. Vizard. He would simply have wolfed it up. Sorry, I read that a bit wrong. If he had found it for himself before he had given his heart away to Mrs. Vizard, he would simply have wolfed it up. Not that the salary was anything. That was only £4 a week, the sort of wage that a good typist gets. It was the sundries, the asides, the prerequisites that made the job worth considering. The post was that of organising secretary to the North Kensington Spiritualist Union. It was a new body, the Union, and its headquarters were in Portobello Road. The premises had been an undertaker's before the spiritualists had taken it over, so the clientele hadn't changed very much. The place was completely redecorated, of course, and Mr. Squales rather liked the chaste fumed oak with which the interior was now furnished. There was a large circular table with copies of Light and The Spirit World and Beyond and The Great Divide, which spread out on it. There was a seasonal bookcase containing the classics of the cults, lives of the famous mediums, records of scientifically controlled psychic experiments, and books on fairies. He'd seen them all when Mrs. Vizard took him over. Not that there was any money for the Union in this side of it. The books were there more for their educational value than anything else. The North Kensington Spiritualist Union, in fact, was really a kind of information bureau, and as such it kept open for deucedly long hours, from 9:30 in the morning until 7 o'clock at night. It was there to solve any kind of supernatural problem that might have presented itself suddenly to the residents of Notting Hill. The times of its own séances and those affiliated bodies, the Tulse Hill Psychical Research Society, the Ponder's End Spiritual Temple, the Golders Green Group, and so forth, were displayed in frames around the wall. It was, as a matter of fact, because of one frame containing the names of mediums prepared to undertake private séances that Mr. Squales finally accepted the post. As he stood there, he saw his own name invisibly overprinted across a lot of them. But 9:30 to 7, he shuddered. To arrive at Portobello Road by 9:30 would mean leaving Dulcimer Street at about 9:15, and leaving Dulcimer Street at 9:15 would mean getting up at 8, even possibly at 5:02. It would be bad enough even now without the summer coming on. In the winter, in the blackout, it would be unthinkable. He might as well be a milkman or a postman. But that was not the worst of it. there was an additional peril attached to the job. One that he couldn't very well talk about, at least not to Mrs. Vizard, and that was there was nothing, absolutely nothing, to hold up the wedding by now, even by another day. Previously it had been simple. He had told Mrs. Vizard outright that he wouldn't marry her until he was self-supporting. Now, thanks to her, he was going to be. The job was open from next Monday, and if he took it, he would be entirely vulnerable. Today was Thursday, only 3 clear days. That was what made him so jittery. And what was more, the room upstairs were all ready. There wasn't a thing more that needed doing to them, and it all happened just as Mrs. Vizard threatened. She insisted on showing them to him in their finished state. With fingers laced romantically, it was Mrs. Vizard who thrust her hand in his, and they went up and inspected them together. It had not been Mr. Squail's idea, the visit, and it had got him down. It had saddened him unutterably. The little room at the side, Percy's room, that had been made into a dressing room for him, was bad enough. All Mr. Squail's clothes, the clothes that Mrs. Vizard had given him, were now arranged so neatly, so methodically, that he realised gloomily that, in future, even if he mislaid a sock or a tie, it would be missed immediately. As for pawning anything, it was the end of all privacy and personal pride, that room. But it was nothing to the bedroom. That was terrific. No sooner had he peeked inside than he felt himself sweating. A ponderous sepulchre magnificence hung over the apartment. Standing there in the doorway, he realised that it was really the late Mr. Vizard's bedroom that he was entering. The peep was really a glimpse into the dead past. The furnishings about them had a genuineness, a solidity that could only come from within the trade itself. The big mahogany double bed with its massive claw feet looked cold and ominous, like a converted sideboard. Aren't you going to say anything?" Mrs. Vizard asked softly. Mr. Squails pulled himself hurriedly together. "What is there left for me to say?" he asked. Mrs. Vizard caught her breath. "You might say that you are looking forward to the day," she reminded him. "It's not long now." There was a pause, an awkward pause. Then he recovered himself. "Looking forward to the day," he repeated in a low voice, his throat like a church organ pealing. "I can think of nothing else." Poor old man. Poor old Mr. Squails. What is going to become of him? Chapter 76. How are we doing? We're all right. Bill had got embarkation leave. That was why Doris was there at King's Cross waiting for him. The train was late. Very late. Nearly 2 hours out of the 48 gone already, and simply standing at the barrier of the arrival platform. Not that Doris was the only one who was lounging about like that. The gloomy cavern of the station was full of tired men and drooping women, all waiting patiently for someone. On one of the seats by the indicator there was a woman with a baby. She'd been there since 7. And it was after 10 o'clock already. Outside the light had faded from the evening sky, and King Cross was settling down to its nightly blackout. The platform lamps, like so many blue inverted night lights, had been turned on by the station master and made a melancholy and futile star shine of their own. Through the murk, the word buffet on the tea-room door showed up magically in 6-inch letters cut out of cardboard. Every 10 seconds or so, word would disappear all together as a soldier carrying the war on his back pulled the door open and went inside. Oh, the word on the door disappeared. Oh, I've got you. Sorry, I misread that. It was the same wherever you looked. Tired, thirsty soldiers. Soldiers going, soldiers coming. The tramp of their boots mingled with the smell of the train oil and the hiss of the high-pressure steam. It might have been the Tottenham Court Road and not the Siegfried line that they were going to storm any moment. Doris had drunk her third cup of coffee and didn't want another one. It wasn't anybody's fault that it was bad coffee. It was just the way things worked out in wartime. A thin, scalding stream of something that tasted of nothing gushed out of the urn into the chipped cup. The girl behind the counter popped a chip of sugar with her fingers and gave a whisk around with a captive spoon. And that was that. All the other spoons were missing. At 10:20 the train was signalled, and Doris took up her place at the barrier again. It would probably be some time before the train was actually in, but she was too excited to wait anywhere else, absurdly excited, and in consequence she felt slightly sick. But that might have been because she hadn't eaten any lunch. She'd been so sure that she would be having dinner with Bill that she stayed in at lunchtime so that she could be sure of getting off early. And now it was supper time already. Just when every second was precious, when things like honeymoon and normal married life were being handed out by the thimbleful, the railways went and poured a whole evening down the drain for you. The lights on the front of the engine appeared suddenly at the far end of the platform, and the crowd came to life again. The women stopped drooping, and the ticket collectors turned up professionally from nowhere in particular to safeguard the interests of the shareholders. As soon as the train stopped, the doors opened and out poured soldiers, with gas masks and knapsacks and tin hats and water bottles and bayonets and bandoliers slung about them, and clutching a rifle and a kit bag, they came lurching through the murk like ghosts from Passchendaele. At first, Doris couldn't see Bill anywhere. Then she spotted him. He came right towards her, but at the last moment the woman next to her claimed him. And that happened again. Bill, unmistakably Bill, turned into someone quite different. In those uniforms, everyone had mysteriously been transformed into the same person. The platform was full of Bills, all in khaki and all lugging a floppy, oversized valise. When Bill did at last come up to the barrier, Doris wondered how she would ever mistaken him for anyone else. His arms as they went round her had the old familiar feel, and it was the same voice that was in her ears again. She clung to him. But for some reason or other she was crying. Large, disconcertingly wet tears were running sideways down her cheek into her mouth. God, what a fright I shall look! I shall look awful, she thought. And as she stood there, she was aware that the gloom all around was full of other figures embracing, small women being absorbed in great bear-like hugs, and raw-looking privates in uniforms which didn't fit anywhere were fastening themselves to an orgy of reunion on the promising young ladies with a lot of fair hair worn over their shoulders. The sound of the big smacking kisses came through the darkness on all sides. But that was only half the story, because in the darkness there was just as many other couples saying goodbye. It was all part of the crazy pattern of the thing. One train full of soldiers came rolling in from the north and deposited its garrison in London, while from another platform, another train, also full of soldiers, was drawing out to keep up the occupation in the north. Together, it was as though someone had had a grudge against home life and had thrust a large ladle of England and given the place a stir. It was the Schifflin plan itself in operation inside England. But with Bill's arms around her, Doris had given up thinking about other people. Here he was, and that was all that mattered. The magic of having him had worked, and she had stopped crying now. "Oh, Bill, it's heavenly," she said. It's just heavenly." "Come on," said Bill. "Let's go and eat something." There wasn't a taxi, and it was in the underground that she noticed what was wrong with him. Bill had grown himself a moustache. A neat, clipped moustache like a colonel's. It didn't seem to belong to him, and what was so puzzling was that, in some ridiculous way, he appeared to be proud of it. He kept running his thumb down it as though, now he had it, the thing had to be petted. The moustache made Doris cross. It was something that he'd done without telling her, and it contrived to separate him from her. From certain angles, he simply didn't look like Bill at all. And there were other changes too, Doris noticed. The uniform, which she had bought with him, no longer looked like somebody else's. He was filling it entirely, and the Sam Browne had lost its first newness. Altogether, he was the complete soldier, in fact. The army had got hold of him, and he belonged to it. It was only his voice and his hands that remained the same. They were strong, competent hands, and Doris sat looking at them because they were the one thing that really seemed to belong to her. "Those are my hands," she kept telling herself. "Those are my husband's hands." And then another disquieting thought came to her. Perhaps I'm not the same either, she wondered. Perhaps he sees differences in me. But Doris needn't have bothered. Bill had one knee pressed up hard against hers, and the fingers of her hand were laced tightly between his. He was in high spirits, and he kept on squeezing her fingers until it hurt. When they got to Piccadilly Circus, he seized hold of her and picked up his case. "This is where we're going to get something to eat," he announced. They pushed their way through to the door of the carriage and forced a passage through the crowd onto the platform. It might have been the evening rush hour instead of 11 o'clock at night, from the way people were lined up there. And they weren't just ordinary people either. It was as though a new wartime race of sharks and trollops had suddenly invaded London and made the Underground their headquarters, as though the Passenger Transport Board had called in Hogarth and Demure to choose their passengers for them. From one end of the platform to the other, the place had an air of thieves' kitchen into which hot, confused men in uniform had irresistibly been lured. It might have been Port Said instead of... it might have been Port Said or Sead, I don't know whether that is, outside and not Piccadilly. Bill, however, did not appear to be unduly troubled. "God, it's good to be back," was all he said. And they went up the escalator behind a Canadian sergeant with his arm around a girl who looked as if she wouldn't go down too well. What? With a Canadian sergeant with his arm around a girl who looked as if she wouldn't go down too well back in Saskatchewan, and came out into the packed booking hall. A couple of sedate policemen patrolled the place, seeing nothing, and all around them the armed forces struggled manfully to forget the war. The telephone kiosks were full of soldiers urgently ringing up improbable numbers. The blackness of the street outside was sudden and unpleasant. At one moment you were climbing a few concrete steps under a row of dimmed electric lights, and at the next you were in the open air, and everything was as dark as a tomb. It was as though someone had slipped up and put a blanket over your head. "Where do we go from here?" Bill asked. "I can't see anything." And then gradually the darkness opened up and unfolded, and they could see the portico of the Atlas Assurance and the vague curving outline of Regent Street. Under the arches, women with the eyes of owls and electric torches, which kept on flashing down their legs, were assiduously hunting. "Ah, it's this way," Bill told her. "There's the Regent Palace." It was bright and cheerful again as they got inside, almost like stepping out of wartime into peace again. "That's more like it," Bill remarked. This is what I came up for." He left Doris for a moment and went over to the reception desk. She thought that he was taking rather a long time when he came back grinning. "It's no use," he said. "They don't trust me. They want to see your identity card too." "But we're not stopping here," Doris began. "Yes, we are," Bill told her. "I've got it all arranged. We've had enough hanging about for today." "But what about Cynthia?" Doris began. "She'll be expecting us. So will Mother." "Fortune of war," Bill answered. "Hold up on the railways, direct hit with a bomb, lost our way, I was drunk when you met me, anything like that. But only for Pete's sake, stop here with me. This is the rest of our honeymoon." They were in bed together in the darkness. Bill's arm was under her neck, and his other thrown loosely across her. "Seems like 2 more years than just a couple of months," he was saying. His voice was sleepy now, and his whole body was placid and inert. It was Doris who was wide awake and sleepless. She tried to rouse him. "You don't think anything did go wrong, do you?" she asked. "It would be awful if I had a baby with you going away." Bill held her close for a moment and kissed the back of her head. "Shouldn't worry," he said sleepily. "Only 1 chance in a million. I'm not such a rotten doctor as all that." Then his embrace loosened again and his breathing became slow and regular. Bill was fast asleep by now. But Doris was still awake, wide awake in fact. She lay there staring out into the darkness. It was a funny world. You married someone you weren't allowed to live with. You married someone and you weren't allowed to live together. You spent a night in a hotel and you had to prove that you were really man and wife before you were allowed to go upstairs to your room. And finally, the possibility of having a baby, which is what you had married for, was the most alarming thing that could come into your mind. And it didn't make any sense living that way. The more you thought of it, the less sense it made. And now we're on chapter 77. And we'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Blimey, that hour went very swiftly. How about that? We're slowly getting there. I don't know if you can see that. We're slowly getting to the end. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me. I hope the strange coloration of the studio didn't alarm you too much. I thought only officers wore Sam Brown, says Dudley Sewer. Sean Ford says, just popped in for minutes. This is so delightful. I wish I could view these live every day. Very nice to see you, Sean. Whoops, Bill is an officer. There you go. How about that? What a poignant picture he paints of wartime farewells at a railway station, says Lee Lawson. Very true. Sorry, I'm stumbling a bit over the words. Edward Moulding says, Mr. Squales, we'll jump on a bus. Where do you want to go, Mr. Squales? As far as 1 shilling and 6pence would take me. Absolutely. What is he going to do? Is he going to get out of it? I can't imagine him going through with living with Mrs. Vizard and getting married. It's I can't remember what happens now. I've read the book twice. I can't remember the end bit. Anyway, there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I will catch up with you tomorrow. We'll do another reading. We're going to finish this fairly soon now. Maybe this week, but maybe early next week, I feel. But there we go. Anyway, thank you for joining me. Take care. And if you're watching the Vobes Show, I will see you later. Till then, bye-bye.